Steinhoff was once one of South Africa's most valuable listed entities, but the scandal-hit company will be no more after shareholders this week voted overwhelmingly to dissolve its holding company. Steinhoff will soon announce a date for its shares to stop trading. Its shares is worth a few cents on the JSE, having once fetched more than 90 rand. Now let's talk more about the end of the Steinhoff era with accountant, academic and activist Khaya Sithole. Khaya, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Now, Bruno Steinhoff started the business in 1964, a type of rags to riches story, if you will. Now, more than half a decade later, the legacy is in ruins. Could you take us back to when Steinhoff was the darling of the JSE and what appealed to investors at that time?
Good evening and good evening to the viewers. So it's actually more than half a century that Steinhoff was in existence for. And I think probably at its peak, it was seen as one of those stocks that everybody could bank on to perform. And of course, why that matters is that we know that a lot of the institutional investors want to have the type of portfolio that has some star performers, the type of assets that you can bank on to pay some healthy dividends and get you some very good capital appreciation. And Steinhoff ticked off all those boxes for a very long time. I think also, whilst we all thought it was a legitimate business, you saw its international expansion, probably indicating that even international investors beyond just the local ones saw potential in it. So, of course, that essentially fueled the fire of its escalating share price. And of course, when we then discovered in 2017 that a lot of this was essentially built on what now turned out to be farcical and made-up fabrications, then of course the fallout was as massive as the growth and the investment had been over the many years in which Steinhoff had been the star performer across the world.
So, Khaya, many people lost all their money or most of their money when the scandal broke in 2017. Is there any chance of recovery of these funds for them?
So I think obviously for investors who obviously lost money, particularly in 2017, and have not been able to recover any of that, it is a day of great disappointment. And I think what we've also seen is that obviously there was an entire spectrum of those that were affected. There were clearly those that were creditors who have somehow been forced to really hold on until now, where they've had to then enter into this new arrangement. There were clearly the investors who then felt that, look, over the 6 years in which the saga has played out, they've had to take whatever existed of their capital and invest it elsewhere. But I think also even now in its current form, essentially whatever remains of Steinhoff now has been repackaged into a new entity. And what has happened is that those shareholders that remained are now going to own a much smaller fraction of that. And then the creditors are going to own the 80%. And the hope is that over the next 3 years, whatever remains within the asset stable of Steinhoff is going to generate some form of cash or sufficient cash to be able to give them something to chew on. Whether any of that is going to materialize is something that we're going to have to observe over the next 36 months.
What happens to the likes of Pepco and other businesses that are subsidiaries of the group?
So the great irony, of course, is that some of these businesses remain quite resilient and they remain quite strong as standalone entities. They just happen to have this hangover of this association with Steinhoff. So these are the entities that have essentially been able to generate some form of cash since 2017. They've been able to somehow find a way to continue operating on the basis of very strong business fundamentals. And it is these businesses that we obviously now hope are going to be able to remain strong and healthy enough to try and assist in paying off some of these pre-existing debts and some of these unresolved legacy issues. So, of course, for as long as those businesses are well capacitated and are well run, there is a strong possibility that they will do something. But of course, there was always a possibility of trying to sell off some of those businesses on a piecemeal basis. But the reality is that it became clear, I think in the middle of last year, that even if you sold those with the best intentions out there, the sum of liabilities are still going to be much more than that. So you'd essentially still leave the investors and the creditors worse off. So that's why those businesses have remained viable.
Just in short, Khaya, do you think the South African corporate landscape has learned from the scandal, so it won't be repeated again?
So the best way to assess whether a country or even the capital markets have learned is the simple question of what they have done since 2017 in order to deal with some of the issues that clearly were the glaring gaps, either in regulatory or in some form of oversight in relation to how Steinhoff was regulated. And on that front, it's a mixed bag. So we've known that some of the regulatory agencies like the FSCA and the JSE have imposed some sanctions on people like Marcus Jooste, for example. But the question of whether a scandal of this nature could be avoided in the future, the question of whether we reformed our oversight and our auditing processes sufficiently enough to ensure that we can pick up when these things happen, that remains a matter of speculation. And unfortunately, we will only know if somebody says, look, here's an issue that seems to have the same issues as the Steinhoff one, and this is how our systems are better capacitated to pick it up at inception and then deal with it. The fact that in the interim we've had issues like Steinhoff, like Tongaat, actually isn't helping.
Thank you so much, Khaya. That was accountant, academic, and activist Khaya Sithole.